So this afternoon's session 3.2 on status and opportunities of DSM in Asia and the Pacific is a discussion that aims to inspire. While DSM, that is energy efficiency and conservation, has been around for some time in some jurisdictions since 1990, that is in the US and some European jurisdictions, it was in some ways the invisible generator. It is now seen. Here in Asia and the Pacific region, DSM is seen as an integral and necessary clean energy solution to navigate the region toward a carbon neutral future. It is clean, and with appropriate knowledge sharing and capacity building, shown to be affordable and indeed provides opportunity for improved power system reliability. In today's DSM status and opportunity session, we will hear from 4 power sector experts. Chrissy Godfrey, specialist leader with Deloitte, will speak to us about the importance of getting the regulatory environment right for successful DSM and untapped opportunity for utility-led DSM. We'll also hear from Udana Ranayake, who will speak to us about energy efficiency and its importance of labeling, building codes, and benchmarking. I should say that Udana is from Chemonics International. So he'll emphasize labeling, building codes, and benchmarking, and he'll speak about demand response opportunity from having successful DSM. Then we have Pankaj Batra, member advisory board and also president, that is, for Panatech. He will slide us deeper into DSM benefits, not just reducing energy use for our consumers, but moving the sector to improved reliability, transitioning demand to the supply side. Last but not least, we will hear from Reggie Kumar Pillai. He's the president of India's Smart Grid. His discussion is on time of use and how important that is to providing a real-time platform. TOU is important, of course, for reducing energy use, but also it enables DSM to move to the supply side on demand response. So with that, we're going to get started with this session, and we will begin with Chrissy. Chrissy, please.
All right. Thank you so much, Kelly. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I thank everyone for the opportunity to be able to present today on this idea. I am going to be discussing the untapped opportunity of utility DSM participation as a catalyst across macroeconomic, energy sector, and business goals. And I'm basing that in particular upon my point of view as a former regulatory practitioner at the Maryland Public Service Commission, where I oversaw over 300 million per year in demand-side management programs, which averted rolling blackouts from lack of generation and a growing ambitious state renewable portfolio standard. Sorry. There, oh, there. All right, it likes to bounce around a little bit. So first I wanted to provide a little bit of background on Super. I'm also the chief of party for a Deloitte implemented USAID program called Strengthening Utility Performance and Energy Reform. It is a $13 million global program. It's really unique. It's able to test out innovative solutions and reforms to advance utility commercialization in order to enhance its financial viability and energy sector-wide stability and sustainability. We feature a few results here to the right. In particular, we have work assignments that are currently active on cybersecurity, climate finance, and technical losses. This can be a very complementary program to other bilateral USAID projects that are underway. It can also fill a niche area that is not able to be covered under a bilateral area or for longer term programs. So today in particular, I'm going to be talking about a new potential work assignment that we have on the radar. It's going to be looking for counterparts in particular for pilots or missions that are interested in exploring this niche in utility-driven demand-side management. And it's meant to advance the USAID energy efficiency building blocks thought leadership and focus in particular on identifying energy efficiency and demand-side management efforts that are well placed for a utility to operationalize and target at its business goals, in particular in financial stability or grid resiliency, for example. And also identify new revenue streams and accelerate policy goals. So, Southeast Asia in particular is a huge opportunity to capitalize on these initiatives, and particularly due to its high electricity demand or forecasted demand. It's not lost on me on the flight over that there was a documentary, I believe, on Singapore in particular, that noted that that Singapore had one of the highest air conditioning rates per capita globally. So if any of this sounds interesting to you after I finish my presentation, please reach out to me. As I mentioned, we are looking for pilot opportunities. So let's just dig into the details a little bit here, if my slides decide to advance. Point it this way. Okay. All right, so let me just preface this with it is very difficult to find information globally on demand side management. It's usually one or the other, mostly energy efficiency. So take these a little bit with a grain of salt. But let me just start off with I have a colleague that commonly jokes that energy efficiency is like the khaki pants of the energy sector, meaning that it doesn't tend to get a lot of attention until it's absolutely necessary. And that tends to be a hardship or a crisis, which lo and behold, we're in again, right? So now energy efficiency is top of mind. And that was the case actually for Maryland as well. It was utility driven energy efficiency had not been seen since the 1990s. But in 2007, we were suddenly facing imminent power shortages. And that was due to potentially strike by 2010. So you can see there's a very short window that we had to prevent that from happening. And energy efficiency was considered one of the fastest ways to find that extra capacity and also to do that cost competitively. DSM is also considered the fifth fuel of the energy sector, and it's usually underestimated in its ability to leapfrog societal goals. It's not as visually appealing as a solar power plant or battery storage. But as the graph shows on the left, and I'm told I do not have a pointer, so I'll just point to the little green box on the left here. That's energy efficiency. I know these are a little difficult to see. Um, it it averages about 1 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour, which is quite cost competitive to any other fuel source that you would consider for generation. The closest in comparison to that would be wind, utility PV, or combined cycle gas. So you can see the blue box there is wind at about 2 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour, solar PV at 2 to 4 cents, and then gas combined cycle 4 to 7 cents. So highly cost competitive. And then to the right, the graph depicts the International Energy Agency's global projections through 2035. And this is just a glimmer of the untapped potential. And if you were in the previous session, this was touched on a little bit. But just looking at the industry and the buildings columns alone, the uncaptured potential is 60 to 80%. So all of that sort of striped grayed in area is untapped. If you were to include transport in that, then you also have the opportunity to dig into electric vehicles, beneficial electrification, and demand response. So neither of these graphs actually depict the demand response potential. This is solely just the energy efficiency potential. So even more opportunity exists if you were to expand this fully into demand side management. And let me also just caveat that as well. USAID tends to refer to demand side management as energy efficiency, but most in this sector would actually call this demand side management, which includes energy efficiency and demand response. So to just further layer on that a little bit more, global energy intensity improvements had averaged 2.1% between 2011 and 2016, dropping down to 1.3% from 2017 to 2020. As of 2021, they were around 0.5%. So clearly we've lost sight of the importance and the potential of energy efficiency. So to put that into the context of the Southeast Asia region with their strong economic growth and NDC decarbonization goals, using Vietnam as a prime example, the World Bank had projected by 2030 energy efficiency measures could reduce capacity additions by nearly 12 gigawatts or 7%. And ironically, in one of the last PDPs that were released, the government's planning, not enough capacity had actually existed for what was the forecasted demand. And many of the transmission corridors are overloaded. They are anticipating a reduction in capacity and power shortages by 2021. That reduction in power is around 13%. So you can see that in the event that energy efficiency was implemented, it would have covered a very significant gap of that potential. All right. So here I'm just going to showcase that we tend to focus only on appliance and equipment standards and building codes. There's a huge whole section of energy efficiency that potentially could be driven through utilities in particular. And so first, I just want to note that we tend to focus on sort of the stick rather than the carrot, right? And much of our work is dabbled in incentives through governments or ESCOs. And what I'm talking about here is actually market-driven DSM that would combine customer-centric utility business model and the power of the consumer data from the utility to strategically harness energy efficiency and demand measures that would align to commercial and policy goals. Those utility incentives in particular would drive further energy efficiency improvements by addressing the cost differential that entice customers to install higher efficiency retrofits than the minimum standards, replace older inefficient equipment earlier, weatherize existing homes, or establish smart energy behaviors. Move on to the next slide. So here are a few of the market-driven utility programs that could exist with traditional energy efficiency through policy codes and standards. There are several catalysts here that make this ideal for policymakers, regulators, and utilities alike. I'm just going to touch on a few here because I can see I'm running out of time. The first is obviously energy savings, which is the equivalent of about 10% of the current energy generation globally. It would fast track decarbonization with a 2-to-1 ratio, reducing not only the amount of generation that we need, but also additional energy savings that would encourage stronger grid resiliency to put more renewable energy on the system itself. It is a huge job creator, both reskilling labor that will be going offline from smart grids, coming online now as demand side management opportunities or other peripheral industries. It also increases grid reliability, flattening peak curves, dense demand growth, and target areas of the grid susceptible to outages and overloads. And lastly, and most importantly, it builds customer relationships with the utilities that are addressing now service quality and value. Try to wrap up. All right, so this is a quick case study. I think I skipped slides, sorry. So just quickly on some of the challenges that are faced. In particular, I'm gonna note that there are 3 bubbles here around customer awareness. So customer awareness, customer centric lens, and customer participation. None of this is really able to be capable for the utility to be successful without customer participation, customer buy-in, also the huge stakeholder process that's involved at the beginning of the process, where you're able to identify what the most value is, how cost beneficial the projects could be for utilities and governments, and have that alignment happen between the governments, utilities, and customers alike.
I'm so sorry, but if you can wrap it up,
I
so
will.
thank you
Yes.
so much.
I'm on like
Okay, thank
the
you.
last slide, but it keeps bumping around. All right. So I was going to talk about the how a little bit. I've obviously run out of time. I'm happy to take questions if you'd like. I had a case study around the Reforming Energy Vision from New York, in particular, that's encapsulated both policy elements as well as utility-driven DSM into the programs that incorporate performance-based regulation, shared savings opportunities for the utilities that would offer new revenue streams, and capability for the utilities to be more financially solvent. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Chrissy. And indeed, we will have time to discuss more, so no worry, without question. So indeed, we heard about some of the partnerships that are necessary to move DSM to utility scale, and there's opportunities there for that. In addition to partnerships with utilities, there's also the need to look at labeling sort of processes as well as building codes. So we're going to hear from Udana on that. Udana, thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. And good afternoon, everyone. So my topic for the day is policy and regulatory initiatives to expedite demand-side management. And I'll be talking from a Sri Lankan perspective. By the way, I'm the residential and an appliance energy efficiency specialist of USAID Sri Lanka Energy Program. So before I get into the core of my presentation, let me give you a brief introduction to Sri Lanka's power sector. Our installed capacity is about 5,000 megawatts, and we consume around 16 terawatt hours of electricity every year. We have an ambitious target of generating 70% of our electricity using renewable energy sources by 2030 and make the sector carbon neutral by 2050. So this requires significant investments, which amounts to around $1.4 billion per year. And for a country currently undergoing an economic crisis, this is not an easy task. So we've identified demand side management as a quick fix to some of the challenges we are facing. As one of the speakers mentioned during the previous session, not using energy is the most cleanest form of energy. So DSM can be categorized into two areas: energy efficiency, which we all are familiar with, and demand response, which is not merely about saving energy, but more to do with having high flexibility in the demand side. So in this context, USAID Sri Lanka Energy Program is supporting power sector stakeholders to transform the industry to a cost-reflective, market-based, and a sustainable one. We operate under 4 key objectives. First is ensuring cost reflectivity of tariff. Second, increased deployment of renewable energy. Third, increased demand side management. And fourth, to promote advanced energy technology. So what I'm presenting today is directly related to what we do under our third objective. So policies are important to set the direction for demand side management. And these policies have to be brought to life through a proper legal framework that includes standards and regulations. And it's the strategies and the plans that set timelines and make stakeholders responsible for implementing certain activities, which will eventually contribute towards achieving a broader goal. But these policy elements alone will not be able to drive DSM in the long run. You got to combine them with access to technology and access to financing. So this is the holistic approach we as a program have adopted. And over the course of my presentation, I will bring a few examples to show you how we do it in Sri Lanka. Electricity is mostly consumed in buildings. I'm sure you would agree with me when I say so. So it's important to make the buildings energy efficient. And one of the first steps, an effective first step, would be to make sure not any new buildings would be inefficient. So basically to prevent inefficient buildings from getting into the market. So this is precisely what the energy efficiency building code does. And it stipulates minimum energy performance standards in areas like air conditioning, building envelope, lighting, power distribution, so that the new constructions or the major renovations that take place will be carried out in an efficient manner, which will eventually result in a building which is energy efficient in the long run. So we've introduced, together with Sustainable Energy Authority of Sri Lanka, the Energy Efficiency Building Code, which is applicable for all buildings that has a square meter or an area above 1,000 square meters, or has an electrical demand over 500 kV. And there is a minimum on the cooling capacity as well. So our contribution to building code is not merely on formulating regulations. We have been active in other fronts as well. So currently we are developing the implementation plan for building code, which includes the institutional models for enforcement, and it also includes the measurement and verification processes. Because we can come up with a regulation, but if it's not implemented, then we will not be able to experience its benefits. And we've been conducting training programs targeting building sector professionals on the code compliance itself, and also certain niche technical expertise like building energy modeling, which is important to design efficient buildings and also to verify compliance. So it's important, while it's important to look at the new buildings, it's equally important to look at the existing stock as well. Because these buildings, once constructed, will be in operation for the next 50 to 100 years. So this is why we are working on energy benchmarking for existing facilities, precisely for different sectors. So what benchmarking does is it introduces minimum performance standards in the form of an energy performance index. So this energy performance index is defined in relation to reference parameters like the building area, or if it's a manufacturing facility, it could be amount of goods produced. So all the buildings that are in that sector will eventually have to meet the benchmark, which is applicable for that sector. So for an office building, this may look like 200 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. So, but for a manufacturing facility, if you take the tea industry, it might be around 0.8 kilowatt hours per kilogram. So likewise, there will be a unique EPI or a benchmark for each sector. So currently we are working on supermarkets and financial institutions. And with benchmarking, we are carrying out energy audits mainly to help the consumers figure out replicable measures that will eventually help them increase their energy efficiency and meet the benchmarks. And these initiatives are supported with grant schemes where we fund innovative and scalable measures, again, to make sure these measures are implemented. And we've also developed the National Energy Benchmarking Portal, because data is the key to implement benchmarks. So we collect data, we facilitate consumers to input data to the portal, and it will automatically calculate the energy performance indices. And Sustainable Energy Authority or the regulator will be able to analyze these data and set benchmarks for selected sectors, and also to prioritize new sectors. Sorry, I think I skipped it. So with these two policies, we are looking at the industrial and commercial buildings, but it's equally important to look at the domestic segment, because in Sri Lanka, 1/3 of the electricity which is generated is consumed in domestic sector. So we've come up with appliance standards. We are working on appliance minimum energy performance standards for appliances. And as an enhanced step, we are working on the star rating standards as well, mainly to increase efficiency of appliances. And when it comes to prioritizing appliances for standardization, we consider the total energy consumed. And we also look at how commonly these appliances are used in households. And there's another important parameter which we look at is the diversity of efficiency of the models available in the market, because it gives a very good idea or an indication about room for improvement. So currently with Sustainable Energy Authority, we are working on a QR code labeling program. Again, data is the key for this policy as well. So through the QR code labeling program, we will be disseminating information to consumers at the point of purchase. So they'll be able to scan the QR code and see the life cycle cost of an appliance. So it's not just about the initial price they're going to pay, they will be considering the energy savings and in turn the life cycle cost. Then they'll be able to make an informed decision. And the same platform to be used by the regulator to collect market data, because we lack market data to make informed decisions when it comes to policy formulation. So the same platform can be used by the regulator to collect and formulate new policies. So while we are working on the energy efficiency front, I need to mention we are quite active on the demand response front as well. Uh, uh, Now, when it comes to demand response, we see possibility or opportunity in several areas of addressing some of the challenges that we face. Now, we are conducting studies and several pilot projects. Through those projects, we've identified demand response can be utilized to reduce peak demands. Then it'll reduce the generation cost and also increase the penetration of renewable energy sources and defer infrastructure upgrades. So eventually the policies or the regulations that we are going to formulate will be in the areas of market structures, tariffs, and smart grids. So what I want to highlight is now when it comes to demand side management, policies are the key and they set the direction, but they need to be supported by technology and financing. And also you need to have proper implementation plans and in place and make sure the subjected parties are supported in the long run to sustain these measures. We can discuss in detail during the Q&A session. So I'm going to wind up now. Thank you.
Donna, thank you so much. We're going to move now. And thank you for introducing how DSM can also move to the supply side of things and create opportunities there. We're going to begin a better understanding of that with India as an example. So we're going to turn over to Pankaj for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Uh, I hope you can hear me properly. Yeah. Demand response, I'll just give a general context of why demand response should be there, why it's needed, and a specific example of the progress which has been done in India for that. When you have so much of intermittent renewables, which is solar and wind, what do you do if there are variations in generation? Because that depends on nature. Generation could go up and down. So one way is that you have standby generation. When the wind or solar generation goes down, you bring up that the standby generation and let it generate so that all the demand is met. But a simpler way to do that and a much more economic and cheaper way to do that is to request people to reduce their demand. So basically, operating frequency, which indicates the balance of demand and supply in a grid, should be 50 hertz or 60 hertz, depending on which country it is, and that has to be stable. Otherwise, the grid can collapse. So either you increase the generation to meet the demand, or you reduce the demand to meet the generation. Up till now, what was happening was that we had mostly controllable generation, which is not dependent on resource like wind or solar. And whatever the demand was met by modulating the generation. But a cheaper way now is that because of the enormous amount of expense of keeping standby generation, a cheaper way is to request people to do it or provide an incentive for them to do it. There are lots of ways of doing that without sacrificing the comfort level or the necessity of that, but which was not being looked at. So I'll just go through this, some of the things that we've done in India. Okay. Yeah, this is a report. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah. This is a report of the Central Electricity Authority, which is the technical arm of the Ministry of Power, Government of India, which along the years you can see the mix of generation, how it's how the bottom is coal, which was increasing and then it started decreasing, and then it increased slightly and now it started decreasing again. But the marked difference that you can see is the renewable energy generation, which is the green one. It is increasing. It has increased substantially, and it will keep on increasing in subsequent years. So this was the status of installed capacity and the generation. So there's a difference between the installed capacity and generation, because coal-based capacity, which is the black portion, was around, the installed capacity is about 51% in 23, whereas the generation from that is 70%, because the renewable and hydro and others cannot run at full capacity throughout for 24 hours. So that's the difference. And if you see this in 2029-30, this is the generation part of it, where you can see coal has reduced from 70 to 54. This is what is anticipated. And the renewable generation has increased to 22% from 10 plus 16% to, yeah, 22%. And this is how the demand is expected to be met in 2029-30. The black line is the demand portion. And if you see the solar, which is excess of the demand, that will be used for energy storage. If you see the bottom, that will be used for battery charging as well as pump storage plant. So the excess energy will be used there, and the same will be utilized during the peak time, which you see the violet color and the blue color, the pump storage, which will be used for filling up. So this is just to give you an example, but this is on an hourly basis. Now this is actually a market which is to take care of that. One way of doing it is reserves, to keep reserve generation. So you have the quick response generation, which is there for the first few seconds, and then secondary, that's primary reserve. Then secondary reserve is where there can be slower acting generation or some other means, and tertiary reserve is when they can take even longer, more than 15 minutes to start up. Just to give you a background of what is required. So India took the first steps towards demand response when they took out in the tariff policy of 2016, where they mentioned in this a definition of, the reason for smart meters. Now, smart meters are, which many of you may know, is which have remote connect disconnect, which means if the demand, if you want to reduce the demand, it can be done remotely. So this was defined also in the Indian Electricity Grid Code, which is used for seeing that the frequency is stable. Demand response, I'm not going to go through the definition, but it is meant for controlling the frequency as well as congestion. This is also now there, it has come out in the ancillary services regulations. So ancillary services are basically for frequency control, voltage control, black start, starting up a grid. These are things where demand response was defined, and it was said that demand response can provide a part of the ancillary services. The ancillary services that I showed you, the curve where I showed you, demand response can also be used. Europe also had started this in 2012, where they said demand response should be treated alongside generations such as generation, standby generation. And 2019, they brought in a demand response through aggregators. So even households can take part through aggregators. This is enabling regulation, basically. Okay. Yeah, so the possibilities of demand response are immense. So I won't go through the details in industry, in commercial, as well as, and then the modes of representing it can be through aggregators or through um, uh, automated demand response, which is through smart meters, as I said. Domestic appliances, so even domestic consumers can take part. For example, if you have a storage water heater, this can heat whenever the electricity is available, and it'll keep it hot because it's insulated. Similarly, an automatic washing machine can do that. You put on the washing machine and it'll continue the cycle whenever the electricity is there. Just some examples. Another example is electric vehicles, where smart chargers can charge at a faster rate when electricity is available and at a slower rate when it's not available. So that's like a demand response. So in terms of cost, it's the cheapest source, the one which is green in the left side. That's the cheapest source as compared to all this other methods of balancing demand and supply. Oh. Anyway, what I'd like to say is that we have so far, I mean, we have been acting pretty royal, that you flick a switch and you get electricity, or on demand you get electricity. But we'll have to switch from that R royal to R responsible, because if you want to see this planet survive, then we have to become responsible citizens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pankaj. Again, we're talking about status and opportunity. So while we understand that demand side management has been around for a while, a few decades, and originally invisible, but now seen, as most of us have spoken about, there is also the opportunity of not just conserving or diminishing the use of energy, as Pankaj touched upon. There's great opportunity on the supply side of things when it comes to demand response. Our fourth speaker today is Reggie Kumar Pillai, and he's the president of India's Smart Grid. Reggie had an emergency and has provided us a video, and he will present on the importance of time of use rates in terms of demand side management and the benefits that time of use rates and pilots that are being implemented in India are materializing and demonstrating some very valuable information. So we'll move forward with Reggie's video now. Thank you.
Respected Chair, Moderator, fellow panelists, and the distinguished experts in the audience, a very good afternoon to all of you. Indeed, I was very much looking forward to be physically present in Asia Clean Energy Forum this year after a gap of almost 4 years. However, due to an unfortunate accident for my wife, I am unable to travel to Manila today. And I thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity, and particularly for making my recording available to all the experts on this innovative project which we are currently undertaking in India on the time of use tariff design on a regulatory sandbox approach for a utility-led DSM. So Respected Chair, Moderator, present in Asia Clean Energy Forum this year after a gap of almost 4 years. However, due to an unfortunate accident for my wife, I am unable to travel to Manila today. And I thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity and particularly for making my recording available to all the experts on this innovative project which we are currently undertaking in India on the time of use tariff design on a regulatory sandbox approach for a utility-led DSM. So
It looks like we've got a problem with Reggie's video, and that's most unfortunate because he speaks about time of use and the pilot that's going on in a localized area and the actual data platform. I can ask.
and customer interactions. When it came to actually implementing a project,
Sounds like we got it
have
back.
chosen to do it in
Glad.
Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state where we have the largest number of smart meters actually in operation. So the real-time pricing signals are given to the participating customers who have smart meters, and we are messaging the price signals every day midnight about the next day's 96 blocks. In India, we do the tariff based on 15-minute blocks of 24 hours.
So I'm going to ask Pankaj, who works with Reggie, to provide some information on this pilot. Again, it's hugely important in terms of it demonstrates the value of time of use rates and with regard to DSM as well as demand response. And it speaks about the importance of having a real-time data platform in terms of ability to not just set price, but see how prices are set in real time. I'm going to pause here with regard to saying more, Pankaj. There is fine.
Yes, I'm also on the board of governors of India Smart Grid Forum. So I've not seen the full presentation, but I'll tell you about the time of use, because smart meters is like a mission in India. Actually, there's an India Smart Grid mission, out of which smart meter is a big part of that. And it's about, I think, 250 million meters in India, which are required for covering all the consumers. And we've got 30 states. It's a federal system. So it can't be forced on every state, but every state is trying to follow that roadmap. There's a roadmap, smart grid roadmap, which was created. Some states have done it to quite a large extent. Some states are a little lagging behind. But the market design was that many of these state utilities are running into financial problems. They're making losses. So that's why they don't want to spend upfront in smart meters to such a large extent. So some of the states which have adopted this are getting a monthly. They're charging it monthly for about 7 years. So instead of spending maybe 6,000 or 7,000 rupees at one stroke, they're charging 100 rupees per month for about 7 years. That's the sort of model that they're going. The important thing in a smart meter is that it's already records every 15 minutes a reading. So it's easy to do a time of use in this. You can preset it based on the peak demand and off-peak demand, where you can have different rates for consumers, or you can even do real-time time of use pricing, depending on availability of, depending on demand and supply situation in the grid, because you're not very sure. I mean, there is a forecasting is mandatory for solar and wind, but it's not 100% accurate. It's pretty accurate these days, but it's not 100%. So for making out that, for taking care of the inaccuracy, you can set the prices depending on the situation of availability and supply in the grid. So a time of use will play a very important part. Now, the difference between what we had in India was demand uh, demand management was as compared to demand response was that demand management, there was just load shedding done whenever the supply was not enough without information to the consumers, and whereas demand response is the willingness, I mean, with the willingness of the consumer to take part in it. It was voluntary, so that somebody wants to take part can then be. There can be two types of tariff. One, high reliability tariff, which is probably guarantees 98% availability of power, and another can be another 50 or 60%, where they say guarantee 50 to 60%, but you can have a lower tariff for that. So it's an interruptible supply tariff. So that's what these smart meters can do. So these are things which are not started yet, but are in concept stage. Although there was there are smart grid regulations which were taken out by the Forum of Regulators, just like you have NARUC, where in the US, where they guide all the state regulators in adopting regulations, and then the state regulation by them adopt it as it is, or they make some changes and take out those regulations. So that there are, it's in a state of progress, and things would gradually move when you have these. But one of the important things for these smart meters is, as I said, the remote disconnect facility, connect disconnect facility helps in the demand response, because you can cut off a supply to a consumer when there is less availability of power, depending on the situation in the grid, and of course they'll be charged lower tariff for that. So that's in brief the time of use meters for smart meters.
Thank you. That's helpful. So we're going to move to Q&A. But before we open it up to the audience to ask questions of the panelists, I just have a few questions to follow up on their discussion. So we'll start with Chrissy. Chrissy ran out of time, so we want to make certain she gets some time to share some of her perspective. So, Chrissy spoke about how market-driven incentives or aspects of DSM are necessary to tap utility scale demand side management. And so one thing that is an issue for utilities or energy companies in the Asia and Pacific region is that, and we talked about it just recently with regard to TOU rates and also from a regulatory perspective by Udana. I guess the question is, how can utilities that perhaps do not have cost of service rates for one reason or another, how can they lead DSM? Because that's the struggle. That's one of the constraints that we deal with on a regular basis. Is there an opportunity to still lead utility scale DSM when you don't have cost of service rates? The question is, if you can, why? Explain. If it's definitely a constraint and it makes it impossible, can you further get into that? Okay.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head on the one slide. I wasn't able to kind of dig into the details more around. And it's true that most utilities do actually have cost of service regulation and less likely, time of use. But regardless, I think, the biggest issue there is typically around either revenue decoupling, for example, like the utilities are certainly expecting to seek revenue recovery for the sales volumes of the power that they're selling. That's the traditional model that they're used to. Whether that decoupling happens or not, which is basically forecasting what the anticipated revenues would need to be over the course of a certain amount of time, while also implementing DSM. You don't necessarily have to do decoupling. There are other mechanisms. I started to talk a little bit about performance-based regulation, for example, or shared savings opportunities. So in that respect, you would develop a portfolio that would be cost effective for the utility, aligned to some of its commercial or business goals that it was looking to enhance, where they could make improvements rather than doing, grid upgrades, for example. They would make DSM upgrades or improvements instead. And in that case, you would either amortize that through, say, a surcharge. It would be a separate charge from the tariff. It could also get incorporated into the tariff, but they would be very closely monitored in terms of their evaluation and verification of those savings. And then you could apply a performance-based tariff or a shared savings tariff, for example, towards that performance target that the regulator would then set and they would have to adhere to. So in the event that they fell short of that, they might be penalized for it. In the event that they exceeded it, they would get a bonus.
Thank you. That's really clear. Can I just do a follow-up? It's clear that some sort of incentive rate making is necessary. And I guess the question is, one thing that's established in many jurisdictions where DSM has existed for a few decades now is the opportunity for an energy company to collect the cost of DSM programs through rates. How do you feel about that? Is that something that that is also important to be examined in Asia and the Pacific region? It would be new for the region in terms of having energy companies and energy regulators open up a energy conservation surcharge, if you will. Could you just touch upon that for a moment, please?
Yeah, sure. I guess a couple points there where I think the focus needs to be for newly established DSM programs would be around, one, making sure that you really understood what sort of cost benefit test you were to apply to those programs and what your end goals were. Are they policy oriented goals? Are they business oriented goals to the utility? And setting those expectations and the performance parameters around that upfront. Also, what is the value to the customer? I realize this is kind of a somewhat new concept, I think, globally outside of the US to have a customer-centric model. But understanding that there is other value that customers place in DSM, for example, around maybe it's improved comfort, maybe it's air emissions, air quality, not just decarbonization, but all of those things should be factored in. We spent a lot of time through the Maryland Public Service Commission when I said we had, reestablished those programs after a 20-year mothballing, if you will. They were never customer-driven programs to begin with. They were generally more lighting, commercial, and industrial programs. So to reinforce, I think, the cost effectiveness around that, and then understanding the tolerance from a customer's perspective around their affordability and their what the visual looks like on the bill impact. As our programs began to grow, there was a lot of customer feedback that we would get around, well, this is now contributing an extra $15 a month to my electric bill, but I'm not participating in it. So really the key there was to make sure that the customers were aware of the benefits, that they were engaged, and they realized that ultimately this was more cost effective than adding generation or taking other measures.
Thank you, Chrissy. Dana, I have a question for you. You had spoken about DSM policies are key to a successful DSM program, and you gave us examples of what's taking place in Sri Lanka. You had also mentioned that in addition to DSM policies, there is technical and financing aspects of DSM that need to be gotten right when there is an attempt for successful DSM alongside implementation. One thing that you mentioned while speaking about these key components of a successful DSM program is that there is a need for a grant scheme, and that your program includes that grant scheme. So I guess the question goes to how important is a grant scheme to possible constraints that deal with technical constraints and financing constraints in today's DSM environment?
Yeah, so if I answer from a Sri Lankan perspective and what we do as a program, the grant schemes are mainly used to prove a proof of concept. Now, for example, when a consumer comes up with a new efficiency related solution, and if that technology is quite new in our context, we will help them to support, the grant will be a support for them to implement it. And once implemented, then you have an assurance that this technology will work out. So then it eventually becomes a bankable concept, and you don't need the support of grants to take it forward from there. So once it's implemented and once it's verified that it's going to work there, and if it's financially feasible, then you can actually get financing in the long run without the need of a grant scheme. So the grant scheme will initially work as an incentive to try out proof of concepts so that these concepts will eventually become bankable.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'd like to follow up on that just with one question. So one thing that you mentioned, and that dealt with having high efficiency equipment or appliances available on the market, and that stood out as something that's really important, not just for data collection, but hugely important, particularly for the market segment, industrial, commercial, as well as domestic residents. And therefore, it appears, based on what you shared with us today, that Sri Lanka has a market of high efficiency equipment. And I guess the question is, how did Sri Lanka get there? Is it importing or is it manufacturing that high efficiency equipment? Thank you.
So when it comes to domestic appliances, we mainly import these appliances. And again, when it comes to the demand for efficient appliances, that has been created through the cost reflective tariffs. So previously we used to have subsidized tariffs, and recently we transformed ourselves to more cost reflective based pricing. So with that, the domestic segment has also realized the importance of demand side management. So there is a natural tendency for high efficient appliances now. And just to highlight the importance of appliances, now it's easy to grasp the generation of a solar plant, but when it comes to calculating the saving that you can achieve through an efficient appliance, it's not really worked out. Now we are currently working on a refrigerator replacement program. We have about 3.5 million refrigerators in Sri Lanka, and more than 1 million is over 10 years old. And if once we replace 1 million of refrigerators, that saving will be equivalent to what a 200 megawatt solar plant will be generating. So we are talking about a market where the installed capacity is 5,000 megawatts. And if you can save what a 200 megawatt solar plant could generate, that's quite significant. So this is not easily recognized by the domestic sector. So that's why the policies are important. But once the consumer understands how much they will gain, and things like QR code labeling program where they get access to life cycle cost, they will naturally go ahead with these initiatives without burdening the government. So the government doesn't have to spend, the private sector or the domestic consumer themselves will spend on these initiatives.
Just one other follow-up really quickly. So thank you for that. That helped us to understand that the government obviously supported movement of the market to actually supply or keep stock of the necessary high efficiency equipment. we all are suffering globally, or we all are aware of, high interest rates and foreign exchange. Is that a constraint that Sri Lanka's DSM programs have had to deal with of late? If so, what have been some of the solutions to loosen up the constraint, if any? Thank you.
Yeah, so with the current economic crisis in Sri Lanka, we've had constraints when it comes to access to, imports. So both the DSM and also the renewable energy sector were affected due to inadequacy of hard currency. But things are improving now. But what we want to work on right now is to make sure that we have the right policies and the environment in place, so that by the time the overall the economic crisis is sorted, and we will be ready with the structures so that the consumers could go ahead with these programs. And there were certain funding schemes targeting energy efficiency, which are currently held up because of the macroeconomic crisis. So, but once that's sorted, I believe there'll be financing schemes coming in, and the people will be able to go ahead with efficiency-related prospects once the overall problem is sorted. But in the meantime, with awareness and with the policies, there is a high tendency for going ahead with DSM initiatives. Like I initially mentioned, they were not aware how much they could save, and it was not their interest because the tariffs were heavily subsidized. But now, when you balance out the benefits that you get by investing in DSM versus a solar plant, sometimes the DSM initiatives might stand ahead of solar, because you are not just saving on the energy, you will also be reducing the requirement for infrastructure upgrades, which will be a benefit to the utility from these DR initiatives, demand response initiatives. What we are looking at is how we could distribute that benefit to consumers as well, so that we create a win-win.
That's a great conclusion to your answer in terms of, consumers. And basically, I want to ask Pankaj, when we speak about DSM, demand side management opportunities, particularly as it relates to demand response, when we think about industrial customers as well as commercial customers, we can see that for them, in assessing their actual cost benefit, actually performing their cost benefit assessment, it's quite clear to them where there can be gains when it comes to energy efficiency improvements. For doing necessary investments for demand side management and load shedding comes quite naturally to commercial and industrial customers, and then also participating in demand response markets when or if they are developed. I'd like to switch and talk a little bit about domestic and residential customers, if you don't mind, Pankaj. I know that there is a lot of pilot data collection and undertakings that are occurring now in India. And my question goes to whether or not there's been any discussion with regard to scope of, or providing scope for community-based aggregator sellbacks. And when I mean by community-based, I mean community-based residential or domestic PPAs, because once again, it's not something that individual domestic customers often think about, particularly if they are not in the well-to-do economic group. There may need to be an aggregator or some sort of community organization that aggregates anything from solar irrigation pumps or solar panels or anything that enables them to not only benefit from their home use, be that, like I said, something small, agricultural, or some sort of cottage industry in their home, but also participate in selling back the necessary power that they've created from a renewable source or from demand side conservation, and it being aggregated back to the grid under community-based PPA. Has there been any discussion about that? If so, can you share, please?
Yes, so there are two things. One you said is about agriculture, solarized pumps, agriculture pumps. There, this is called this is under the Kusum scheme of the Government of India, which is where the farmer benefits. I mean, if he gets incentivized to put up solar cells. Either he does it or the government does it for him, and charge. The government gives a subsidy, so he has to pay something, and the government gives part of it. So there, whatever electricity is surplus, they're grid-connected solar pumps. Whatever electricity is not used for pumping goes back to the grid, and they get paid for it at a predetermined tariff. So that is not exactly demand response. It is better utilization of solar pumps. As far as demand response is concerned, there was a pilot, as you said, in Mumbai, which is through an aggregator model, where the aggregator, which was Customized Energy Solutions, they aggregated the demand from maybe 100 customers. And it was a pilot where when they were asked in advance that for the next day during the peak time, it was mainly during the peak time that they wanted the demand reduced, so as to, so that the state did not have to purchase high cost power. So they were told for 1 hour or 2 hours to cut the demand between so and so time and so and so time, and they would get an incentive. So the logic of that was that the normal price of electricity during the off-peak hours used to be around 3 rupees 50 paisa per unit. I'm talking in Indian currency. And the peak power used to be about 7 rupees per unit, double that. So out of the 350 that they would save, they would pass on an incentive to the aggregator, and the aggregator would pass on an incentive of, I think, 2 rupees 50 paisa to the customer for taking part in the demand response. So that was an aggregator model. And just for your information, Mumbai Airport, it was also a demand response customer. And how they would use that, they did not cause any discomfort by reducing the demand. How they did it was that they had 3 chillers for maintaining the temperature of the AC between 22 and 24 degrees. So what they would do is they would be asked to reduce, say, between 7 and 9 p.m. or 6 and 8 p.m. By a certain amount. So it was so aggregated demand. So each person probably had to reduce demand to a small extent. So they, for example, they reduced the demand by 10 megawatt. They had 3 chillers of 10 megawatt each, and they would run all the chillers just before the demand response period. So the temperature goes down to 22. And then they would shut off one chiller. And for the next 2 hours, the temperature would slowly rise from 22 to 24. So that was what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to stick to that. So without inconveniencing the passengers, the temperature would stay within that limits, but they would still get an incentive for reducing the demand for those 2 hours. So this is just one method, but there are many ways every customer would think for themselves where they can reduce the demand without causing any issues to either the customers if it's a public thing, or even to the household, as I said, the demand. So that's an aggregator model, and which has been allowed in the ancillary services regulations of CERC, the central regulator. That's not operationalized yet because the procedures are being finalized, but hopefully that will result in takeoff of demand response in India. Actually, demand response even in Europe has not taken off to such an extent, even though they've got those directives of the European Union where they can be they're equally placed as compared to generation. But I'd just like to say that demand response is something where it's the cheapest form of balancing generation. So not only do you reduce the demand, the additional standby generation, but you also help the existing generation to run at a more constant rate. Because if you go up and down in a coal-based plant or a gas-based plant, you lose efficiency if you make it ramp up and go down. So if a conventional power plant operates constantly at a high plant load factor and you do the management of balancing through demand response, you save on that, which has been calculated by CA in India, and that's the cost of balancing was calculated at 1 rupee per unit. So that's whereas the cost of the renewables was around 2 rupees or 250. So that's a huge saving in terms of just operating the plants better and the deviation from the schedules.
Right. So you've already, can I just ask you to turn off the mics? You've already deep dived into my follow-up question that I had. So, we often are speaking about not just demand side management, moving to demand response. We're talking about power sector products that we often that are often invisible for the normal everyday people who are now getting active with regard to DSM as well as demand response. And so we spoke about a number of things such as, balancing that goes with frequency regulation and black start and things like that, that are ancillary services that are not necessarily an everyday part of speech for ordinary people living in homes or like I said, working in a cottage industry. So I guess my question is, when we speak about these things, and this does stick with the aggregator perspective, when we speak about these very important products that go to making every sovereign's power sector strong and sustainable, is there opportunity for private sector to enter into this space? If so, what's needed to encourage private sector so that all of the burden doesn't rest with the government in terms of moving DSM to demand response from a supply perspective? Thank you. I'll pause here.
Yes, in fact, these opportunities would for creating products for demand response, for example, smart meters, where this would only be with the private sector because the government sector would not be manufacturing of smart meters. So smart meters is one, and having aggregators and aggregators. So these would mostly be private players who would aggregate. They wouldn't be the government. The government sets the policies and the regulator sets the regulations, but the people who participate for getting these products would be private participants. And that would encourage competition, actually. You can have bidding, because there's bidding for these ancillary services, and whoever offers the cheapest price for doing that balancing wins the bid. Therefore, it should only be the private sector, and it encourage multiple players for doing that, yes.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay. Oh, yes, please, if you can just go to the mic.
Thank you. Great discussion. I had a question for Mr. Pankaj Batra, sir. And I just wanted you to comment on the sort of changes or thinking that's taking place in terms of liberalizing the retail sector, electricity retail part. I know that there was a lot of focus also on creating consumer rights. And I think part of operationalizing DSM is also on the ability of the institutions and market to be able to create certain kinds of rights for consumers who can then access electricity prices in real time, etc. And I know India has made some considerable progress in this area, and I just wanted you to comment on where you see the current status of that, and particularly about the retail reform. Thank you.
Yes, the Electricity Act in India is being amended, and distribution reforms is a big part of that. You're right. The intention or the idea was to get competition into the distribution sector, where a consumer can have choice of supplier. Now, there was resistance from that from the existing government-owned utilities, which are of the states, basically. So there are ways of doing that where you set norms for distribution operation in terms of efficiency. Hopefully, things will move. I can't comment on what will happen, but these are and that's on the cards in the amended Electricity Act. If that Electricity Act gets passed, then you'll have a lot of distribution reforms taking place, and hopefully the choice of consumers. Actually, there's even without these reforms, there was in the city of Mumbai, which is the commercial capital of India, there has already been competition, because earlier the distribution was segregated in areas. For example, there are utilities. One is owned by Tata's, one was owned by BSES. And they were supposed, I mean, initially it was thought they would have to supply in their own areas. But there was a case where a customer in one area asked for supply from the utility which was not in that area. And that actually, a customer won it. And therefore, there was a landmark decision of allowing competition. That means one supplier being able to supply in somebody else's area, the distribution system of another area, and open access was to be provided. So that's happened actually, but on a large scale, it would happen if the reforms in the act itself gets amended to allow that. Yeah.
Yes, please, if you can go to the mic. It was and then you're after her. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on the question to see the other side of the coin. If you allow retail competition, the first that will exit are the large ones, the large consumers that can exit. And often you find your situation where the utility is left with the customers that pay the less or do not pay. Has India faced that situation, and has there been any response to that in order to avoid also that cherry picking effect? Thank you.
You're right. That could be a concern, that all paying customers shift to one supplier and all the non-paying customers are left behind with the supplier. That could be an issue. Therefore, there's a considered, discussion going on how to do that, to balance the type of customers. The industrial customers also have the highest tariff to pay, and commercial customers, whereas the residential customers have a cheaper tariff, and the agriculture customers too. So there is a discussion on how to manage that, maybe through a mix of customers, which would have to be spread out between the various suppliers, or a sort of a fund which would balance that, to see that the tariff of, they're not unfairly placed as far as that. So those modalities are being worked out, but not yet done for the time being. Yes. So all I can say is that these are concerns which would need to be addressed. But at the same time, competition should be allowed, because if you allow, if you do not allow people to shift at all, then there's no competition then. So I think that those things should be taken care of and would be taken care of.
So yeah, stranded assets or stranded investments are always an aspect of fallout from competition. There's also the possibility of an exit fee, depending on how big the industrial is. And then there's also, goes back to the question that was asked about consumer rights and the obligation to serve and to ensure that there is reliable power, even in the state of a competitive situation. You had a question, please.
Thank you once again for your very interesting presentations and the precise clarifications you provided. So This is Omar Teretele. I'm Deputy Head of Energy Efficiency, Renewable Energy Policy and Sustainable Development Department of Ministry of Economy of Georgia. So, and it's a privilege being here today and to listen to so many issues coming on energy efficiency, renewable energy. So my question refers to the following. So you mentioned the importance of the construction codes and the saving factor in the residential and public sector, and it's also very important for us. And we are working in carrying out several reforms in Georgia. So your experience will be really very productive and fruitful for us to be shared. So do you carry out or just proceeding any kind of reforms related to the energy auditing or the EPC, this energy performance certificate of the buildings in residential sector, in public sector, or just I wanted to get more, or could you elaborate more in this direction? Where are you right now and what are your plans? Thank you in advance. Yeah.
So with the implementation of the building code, so basically in order to verify compliance, now we have this energy auditor regulation, and where the accredited auditors are registered after carrying out certain audits and fulfilling certain education requirements. So they are registered as accredited auditors. The same set of auditors will be allowed to verify compliance of the new buildings as per the code, and the verification will happen in two stages. And first at the design stage, where they go through the design and make sure the design is in compliance with the code, and there is a building commissioning to be done and certain data to be submitted, and that will also be verified with through auditors. So we have this challenge with not enough auditors being registered. So with the increasing demand, we would require more and more auditors. So we plan to introduce reforms to that auditor regulation as well, depending on the complexity of the building. Different levels of auditors will be introduced. So currently we have one level of accredited auditors. You need to have so much of experience to become an accredited auditor. So with this new reform to the regulation, we will be introducing multiple levels for auditors, and we believe that there'll be more auditors being registered, and depending on the size of the building and what sort of energy systems are incorporated in the building, so different one of the levels of auditors will be able to verify compliance. So that way we plan to increase the number of auditors and cater to the demand. Did I answer the question?
Yes, please.
This is Siddiq Zubair from Bangladesh. So my question is to Sri Lankan presenter, that you said that cost reflective tariff creates an opportunity for implementation of the demand side management activities, especially in the buildings in Sri Lanka. But we know that that where there is a government is the only buyer of bulk electricity and supplier of the electricity government agencies, there's in most of the cases that inefficiency in the companies are passed through to the customers in the name of the cost reflective tariff. So in that case, is there any incentive mechanism from the government to ensure the demand side management activities rather than only to bank on the tariff?
Yeah, so as you have correctly pointed out, since we have this single buyer model, which is vertically integrated, there is always the possibility of transferring the entire cost to the consumer. And we are also looking at a reform structure for the power sector, which is currently under discussion. And other than that, on the demand side, management side, in addition to being cost reflective and sort of pushing the consumers to adopt certain initiatives, the government has also supported the DSM through certain other measures like providing tax incentives. For example, if you are importing LEDs as opposed to incandescent lamps, the customs duty will be very much lower. Now, in future, what we plan to do is even for refrigerators and even other appliances, we plan to introduce concessions when it comes to duty. And currently, since we are facing an economic crisis as well, certain things like, let's say, now we've allowed solar panels to be imported, since that is required to meet our targets. So even with the less amount of hard currency, the efficiency related high efficient appliances or the renewable energy related equipment have been given priority when it comes to imports. So likewise, certain initiatives have been implemented, and even when it comes to utility driven DSM, since the utilities are owned by the government, we've carried out certain utility driven DSM programs where the LED bulbs were distributed through the utility and the cost was recovered over a period of time through the electricity bill. So likewise, there are certain incentives, and but in the long run, it has to be the structure might have to be reformed, where the entirety of cost may not be transferred to the consumer, but there is an incentive for the utility as well to become more efficient. So one of the areas we might look at is maybe not in the near future. Now, if you look at the telecommunication industry, so there is a supply and they become very innovative with data bundles. How they structure their offering is very much different to how a utility would look at it. So if you can differentiate the network operator from the supplier, then the supplier has the capability of becoming more innovative and providing customized solutions to the consumer that will sort of support them and their DSM initiatives as well, like time of use bundles, for them to reduce consumption during peak time. So you can be innovative more with a more reformed structure here.
Thank you. Then we've got one more question and then we have to wrap up.
I'm Chandan Ghosh from your neighboring country, Nepal. I have a couple of comments. Like when we are talking about energy efficient buildings, are these buildings different from what we are constructing these days, or are the differences are only the appliances? Secondly, who would generate the QR codes and how much trustworthy they are, or is there a chance of the customers getting, cheated just by generation of very, very good looking QR codes? And thirdly, I think we should also give incentives to efficient energy appliance manufacturers, because like highly polluting vehicles are banned. Similarly, highly inefficient equipment shouldn't come to the market at all. So,
Donna, can you quickly answer that because we're running out of time?
So when it comes to buildings, as I mentioned during the presentation, they look at certain areas like air conditioning, lighting. So they stipulate minimum performance standards. So some of the buildings which are currently constructed, they still go with inefficient technology. So it's not on the appliance side, it's on the infrastructure that is incorporated in a building, like the air conditioning system. So you have a minimum performance standard. If it's a chiller, if it's a lighting, this is the maximum amount of wattage that you can use per square meter, likewise. So it's quite different to the ordinary buildings which are currently constructed, more efficient. And I was not very clear about the second question you asked. So it's not, yeah, QR code. Yeah. Okay. So the QR code. Yeah, so basically what we are doing is now when you scan a QR code, then you get an access to a certificate which is issued by the authority. So that is an indication the particular QR code you are scanning is credible. So that's on the appliances. Yeah, so but we do regular testing. Now yeah, so currently what's happening is when you, at the point of import, you take a sample and test it. So apart from testing it initially and giving the certificate, at the point of import, it gets tested. And also we are formulating, the Sustainable Energy Authority is formulating a new regulation where the Consumer Affairs Authority is given the responsibility to do spot checks. So they will pick an appliance from the market, send it to a test laboratory and get it tested. There was a third question.
Question dealt with whether or not you can incentivize manufacturers
Yeah.
to stock high efficiency equipment. Is that something that should be considered?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to incentivizing manufacturers, if we offer duty concessions, if you reduce the customs duty on efficient appliances, people are anyway motivated to export efficient appliances to Sri Lanka. So that's one strategy, and there could be certain other ways of incentivizing as well.
We're out of time, but let me just wrap up really quickly. There definitely is a continuation of demand side management as it was formulated back in 1990. And so their status quo is the same in terms of how it works. Nevertheless, there's tremendous opportunity in terms of going forward and affecting emission reduction as well as empowering consumers. So energy company-led DSM is definitely something that is needed to be examined by many of the client countries here in Asia and the Pacific region. The importance of codes and standards cannot be underestimated, as well as collection of data for market purposes, as well as better understanding of what supply and demand is from smart meters. So smart meters can't be underestimated as well. It's really important that we understand that while we're looking at these from a demand and supply perspective, that consumer rights and the importance of having a social perspective is not lost as we watch the opportunities for demand side management come to fruition in Asia and the Pacific region. So with reform, with choice, there's also need for protection. We'll close there. I thank the panel for their wonderful presentations and this lively back and forth Q&A. I'm sorry we've run out of time. We're grateful. Thank you so much.